Hello and welcome to Gladiator for Europe. I am your host, Liam, joined as always by Russian Sam.
Hello.
So, I've lived in California for these last couple of years, but some real Gladio heads might know that I've spent most of my life in Florida. Sam, have you ever been to Florida?
I've been a couple of times when I was a kid, just like family vacations. You know, I got the works, I got to go to Universal, I got to go to Disney. Great stuff.
Oh yeah, the classic. Yeah. What comes to mind when you think of Florida?
Stolen elections, George Zimmerman, crocodiles.
Yeah. No, that's a pretty good summary. Yeah.
Cubans.
Yeah. Very prominent Cuban community, you know. Shout out our pal Jamie. The thing about Florida is that in a lot of ways it's different from the other 49 states, but it still manages to be the most American of all of them. You know, I think that when you think of what's right and wrong with America, like you said, you know, the terrible politics, the terrible weather, but also the lovely scenery, you see all of that in the Sunshine State, you know? Where else would you have something as ambitious as building a giant theme park centered around a glowing castle in the middle of a swamp? You know, that's a very American thing to do. I think that Florida in so many ways is this remarkable and terrifying experiment, you know, and it's got a pretty mixed reputation these days, especially due to the current political situation. But even the kind of guys with Salt Life stickers would probably admit that Florida is a sunny place for shady people. And as we're going to talk about today, this has been the case for a very long time, a lot longer, in fact, than it's been the case for the rest of the contiguous United States.
Even longer than there's been a United States.
That's right, because everybody listening to this podcast has probably heard of Ponce de Leon, the conquistador who claimed Florida for Spain in the 16th century, and probably the first European to set foot in the mainland US. He marched up and down the peninsula, releasing hordes of wild pigs whose descendants still roam the state today in a futile search for gold and maybe also the Fountain of Youth. Regardless of what Ponce de Leon was looking for, he didn't find it. He was probably the least competent of all the famous conquistadors, and there's some good competition for incompetence there.
Oh, absolutely.
He didn't find any glory, any gold, and instead he just led his men into many deadly expeditions. They antagonized the local indigenous peoples, especially the Timucua in the northeast and the Calusa in the southwest, often capturing women and children as slaves, and then losing lots of battles against the indigenous people. The very same year that Hernan Cortez proclaimed himself as the ruler of Mexico, Ponce de Leon decided he'd leave his mark on history by establishing a permanent colony around modern-day Tampa. But basically, as soon as he got off the boat, he was shot with a poisoned Calusa arrow and died. No Europeans would attempt to settle Florida for another 40 years. The Fountain of Youth would never be found. The Fountain of Youth story about Ponce de Leon came around pretty soon after he died. There's no real evidence that he actually looked for the Fountain of Youth. But I think there's another angle here to Ponce de Leon that's very relevant to this episode. So this episode isn't going to be about Ponce de Leon. This is about the constant story of foolish adventurers attempting to tame the Florida landscape, because they're convinced that they're going to be the ones to finally do it. And inevitably, all of these guys fail. These kinds of schemes happen constantly, whether it's Ponce de Leon, whether it's a real estate scam in contemporary Florida, whether it's cryptocurrency.
Or whether it's the Koreans, who we spoke about a few episodes back. Once again, Florida. Florida is the skeleton key for it all.
Absolutely. And much like the Koreans, this episode will focus on a utopian colony founded on the Florida shores. This is a colony that's about as obscure as the Koreans, although just as interesting. And what's especially remarkable is that it was founded about 150 years earlier in a very unusual circumstance. This episode is going to be about New Smyrna Beach, a town that's today known as a pleasant, if slightly forgettable, seaside town. But 250 years ago, New Smyrna, just New Smyrna then, it wasn't a beach yet, was the largest single colonial venture at that time ever taken in the Americas. And very unusually, it was an operation bringing thousands of settlers from Spain as well as the Ottoman Empire to Florida, all under the auspices of the British Crown, and at the invitation of an ambitious and, as we're going to learn, shockingly bloodthirsty Scottish merchant named Andrew Turnbull.
It's always the Scots with their fanciful colonial ventures.
Indeed. That's right. Although after only a decade, this colony would be totally torn apart by violence and disease, and the survivors would assimilate into local communities, New Smyrna serves as a really interesting window into the broader history of colonial Florida, and I would argue settlement of the Americas more broadly. This is going to be a quick crash course on early Florida history with a focus on the St. Augustine, New Smyrna area. This is a really fun topic, and I'm drawing basically all of it from a book called New Smyrna, an 18th century Greek Odyssey. Very romantic, real page-turner, written by a historian from the 60s with the incredible name Epaminondas P. Panagopoulos. And so Panagopoulos, who was himself obviously of Greek descent, meticulously tracked the settlement of this colony, even going to the places in Greece where many of these migrants initially came from. And it's a great story. But before we get there, Sam and I are going to briefly run over the ensuing colonial history, the 200 years between Ponce de Leon's death and the arrival of Andrew Turnbull and his massive colonial force of Spanish and Greek settlers. This way, we can understand why exactly it made sense for these hundreds of Mediterranean islanders to migrate to Florida under the British Crown.
Yes, but before we begin, we just like to remind you to leave a rating and or a review on Spotify, iTunes, whatever. Just let us know what you guys like, what you don't like, what you want more of. And of course, DM us on Twitter. Let us all know. So please leave us a rating or a review, and you'll be safe from the Calusa raids, most likely. We can't make any promises, but we'll try. So continuing from Ponce de Leon, a couple of decades after that, in 1562, another group of Europeans would attempt to settle in the Florida swamps. But this time, these people wouldn't be in the service of the Spanish crown, or really any crown for that matter. Instead, these were religious refugees, Huguenots, led by the well-intentioned but terribly naive French explorer Jean Ribaut, who thought that he could escape the brutality of the European wars of religion by setting up an independent state for French Protestants in Florida.
Right, and that's another common theme here, which is refugees in Florida. That's going to be a really big part of this New Smyrna story. It would be primarily settled by refugees, and then at the end of the day, the people who settled it would become refugees once again, and many of them would leave Florida. But let's, stick with the 16th century for now.
Ribaut himself, he was a Huguenot naturally, and he initially visited Florida with the support of the French king, but he discovered that there was no sign of any Spanish presence.
Right, after Ponce de Leon, nothing.
And so he left behind a small contingent of soldiers at an outpost that he called Fort Caroline, where they supported themselves by trading with the Timucua tribes, who were initially very friendly and even helped to build the French fort. When Ribaut returned to France, he tried to petition the crown to fund the creation of a Protestant colony, but an outbreak of open civil war made him realize that a Protestant would not be safe in France at all. He went to England next, where he briefly met the young Queen Elizabeth to ask her for her support. She nearly agreed, which would have turned Florida into the first English colony in the Americas.
Before Roanoke. Pre-Roanoke.
Yeah, by a long shot. But at the last minute, an unknown advisor suggested that this guy might be a possible spy, so he got arrested and hauled into the Tower of London. And so Ribaut spent a couple of months there, and upon getting out, he decided that he would attempt to settle Florida without any royal support, just with a little spit and shine and put it all together by yourself. He gathered around 800 Huguenots who had nowhere else to go, and they sailed to Florida.
Right. So this whole big fleet leaves Normandy, heading toward Florida. When a fleet like that goes through the Atlantic, it tends to get noticed. And so a Spanish captain off the coast of Cuba realized all of these ships with French flags were sailing to their territory. They sent a guy named Pedro Menendez de Aviles to investigate what these Frenchmen were doing, which would end up being an absolutely disastrous choice from the French perspective, because Pedro Menendez was not a nice guy, and he hopped on a warship with 40 Spanish soldiers to stalk the refugee fleet up the coast to what would eventually become St. Augustine and also New Smyrna. At the time, though, neither of these settlements existed. Instead, it was only the site of the French Fort Caroline, which I think it's important to note here, predates St. Augustine. When Ribaut got to Fort Caroline, he hoped to find a thriving military outpost, but instead, he realized that his fort had been reduced to a skeleton crew of just a few men. Because as soon as Ribaut left, a civil war broke out among the Timucua tribe. The French garrison refused to help any of the two sides, which led to both clans no longer trading with the French, and even occasionally leading raids onto the fort. These raids, as well as the constant malaria outbreaks, killed most of the soldiers, leaving only a few left. They were only able to sustain themselves by taking the rickety ship all the way down to the Caribbean to raid Spanish colonies, which was very dangerous and offered very little reward. And on top of this, they're half starved, like we said, the malaria, so not a great time. All this means When Ribot's 800 settlers suddenly approach the fort, the surviving soldiers have only one message: turn back. Florida isn't worth it. And if those 800 people had taken that advice, they would have lived much longer, much happier lives. Instead, Ribot told the settlers it was nonsense. The Huguenots were destined to make Florida their homeland. The remaining soldiers told him they were on their own. They took Ribot's ship back to France, and the 800 settlers got to start building what they thought was going to be their utopia. Again, very common theme here. The Crussians, the Huguenots, were about to see New Smyrna too. So when immediately after the French landed, the Spanish captain Menendez sneakily docked his ship nearby and approached the camp alone, dressed as a Frenchman. He entered the chaotic settlement and spoke in broken French, where he learned that these settlers were not simply French interlopers. Instead, they were something much worse. They were Protestants, whom the government of King Philip II regarded as illegal heretics. Menendez returned to his ship, where he spoke with his chaplain, a priest named Francisco Mendoza. Menendez and Mendoza decided that these 800 French settlers could, if left to their own devices, quickly grow to 8,000, enough to completely dominate Florida. Worse, the establishment of a Protestant Calvinist stronghold could lead to this heresy taking root across the new continent. And from the Spanish perspective, this could threaten the souls of tens of millions of Indians, whom they saw as their destiny and their duty to convert to Catholicism. Menendez's party were outnumbered by the French 20-1, but they had the element of surprise on their side. They realized that their only hope was that week save the New World by striking the heresy at its heart.
Well, thank God they rooted out Protestantism out of the US. Imagine how bad it could have gotten.
So on the night of September the 29th, 1565, Menendez and his men celebrated the feast of St. Michael and asked God for their souls before marching into the French camp under the cover of a roaring tropical storm. As soon as they got there, they began a merciless slaughter of every Frenchman and woman and child they could get their hands on. Father Mendoza pleaded with the soldiers to spare those who weren't adult men, but the soldiers seemed to think that all Protestants were the same, and the French had very little resistance to offer, because it turned out that during this, all of their armed men were away looking for food in the waters north of Fort Caroline. Hundreds were slaughtered that night, but they realized several hundred more were still alive, and those who were alive were soldiers, including the leader Jean Ribot. For 2 weeks, Menendez and his men tracked the French throughout the swamps, looking to kill any who remained. With the help of some local Timucua people who resented the French for sitting out their civil war, they encircled Ribot's hideout. It was a crude fort built from the wreckage of his last good ship. The remaining Frenchmen were heavily armed and well-trained. They still outnumbered the Spanish, but they didn't know this. As far as they knew, there was a massive Spanish army around them. Menendez, using this assumption, organized a parley with the French. And over bread and wine, he met with Jean and promised him that if they'd lay down their arms and marched back to Fort Caroline, they'd be reunited with their family and spared. Very naively, Ribot said, "Sure, let's lay down our arms and go back to the fort. I'm sure these Spaniards will treat us nicely."
Ribot is convinced. He got all his men to lay down their arms, and they headed back to Fort Caroline. But on the way there, one of the men caught sight of a huge mound of rotten corpses from the massacre a couple of weeks prior. Then it was clear that this was a trap. Many of the Frenchmen tried to run, while Ribot still foolishly urged them to trust the Spanish. One of the Frenchmen attacked Ribot for being a moron, quite frankly, but the Spanish killed all those who resisted. Menendez told the obedient survivors that they just had to follow him over the dunes and that there would be a ship waiting for them. But when they reached the coast, there naturally were no ships. So Menendez asked Ribot, "Remind me what religion you guys are again?" He said that they were Calvinists. So Menendez tried again. "What religion are you guys?" And Ribot once again said that they are Calvinists. At which point Menendez nodded and ordered his soldiers to kill the remaining Frenchmen for the crime of heresy. Or in the parlance of the times, Lutheranism. The Spanish called every Protestant a Lutheran. And so in a letter sent directly to King Philip II, Menendez wrote, quote, "I put Jean Ribot and the rest of them to the knife, judging this to be necessary to the service of Lord our God and your majesty. I think it is a very great fortune that this corsair be dead, for he could accomplish more for the King of France in 1 year with 50,000 ducats than with other men in 10 years with 500,000 ducats.
And then after this, famously, hundreds of corpses were pinned to trees across Florida as a warning to the Timucua and any surviving settlers, and around their necks were signs reading that they were killed not as Frenchmen, but it's Lutherans. The inlet where these men was killed is today called Matanzas, Spanish for massacre. The Spanish soldiers established a new town near the site of Fort Caroline, and it's a town that still exists today. In fact, it is the oldest surviving European settlement in the United States. You've heard of it. St. Augustine.
And so news of the massacre reached Europe quite quickly. Philip II insisted that this had been necessary, and not for any political reason, but because this saved millions of souls from hellfire, people, Native Americans who otherwise might have been swayed into heresy. He even got a legal professor to release a statement to that effect, explaining that this massacre was not only justified, but quite merciful, because you see, the traditional punishment for heresy was being burned alive. But Menendez simply beheaded the captives. How very merciful. Spain hoped that this brutal bloodletting would allow them to reassert control over Florida and establish a foothold in the American South, but the indigenous peoples of the region had other plans.
Right, because a year after the founding of St. Augustine, the new Spanish town was burned by a group of Timucua, who got buyer's remorse for picking the heavy-handed Spanish over the French. And shortly after, the Timucua made contact with one of the only survivors of the massacre, a Frenchman who I believe was a Catholic, actually, named Dominique de Gorges. And so a mixed army of French and Timucua guerrillas snuck into the fort and pulled dozens of Spaniards out of their beds. They were found hanged outside the walls of St. Augustine the next morning, this time wearing their own signs that read, "Killed not as Spaniards, but as murderers."
And this really marked the end of colonial ventures in Florida for quite some time. Naturally, a place where this kind of stuff happens isn't the most attractive destination for settlers. So for the next 200 years, it would be a contested territory between the Spanish, the French, and especially the English forces. Florida, that is. Yeah. English privateers like Francis Drake attacked St. Augustine multiple times. The Spanish, although they didn't care that much about Florida, still wanted to maintain a check on British expansion in North America. So across the 1600s, English settlers would establish colonies from Canada all the way down to Georgia, making the dream of Spanish domination of the entire New World look increasingly remote.
Yeah, and just jumping on here, you remember from the Matt Christman episode, 17th century, all about the era of universal Habsburg monarchy. The English are a really big thorn in that plan.
Yeah, and English settlement, it looked very different from Spanish settlement. In the South, they relied almost entirely on African slave labor. There was some slavery in Spanish Florida as well, but it was mostly domestic. The English, as well as smaller numbers of Scottish and Irish settlers, also treated indigenous people more brutally as a rule than the Spanish did, as they sought to push them off their land to expand plantation slavery. And this expansion of slavery, it generated a lot of wealth for the moneyed settlers, but also it opened up a very important vulnerability that could be exploited by the Spanish. It was reliant on the labor of millions of subjugated people, this new economy, and so the fear of these people rising up, it would be a nightmare for slavers for centuries in the Americas, really. And so the Spanish, they tried to use this kind of stuff to their advantage all the time. So in the 17th century, they offered blanket amnesty to any slaves or Native Americans who escaped British captivity. For the low price of becoming Catholic, they could settle in Florida as free men. With this strategy, the Spanish were hoping to use honey, not vinegar, to destroy the slave economy of the American South. As a general rule, after the massacre at Matanzas, the Spanish ruled Florida with a pretty soft touch. There was a lot of leeway towards Native Americans and black people, although this shouldn't be used to assume too much about Spanish colonialism more broadly. In Cuba, for example, the treatment of black and indigenous peoples was just as brutal as anything the British would be doing in America. But in Florida, the fears of encroaching Anglo settlers from the Carolinas and Georgia meant that they needed all the allies they could get, so they were forced to, use honey.
Yeah, and so, for example, by 1700, large numbers of African freedmen had settled around St. Augustine. This really outraged the English slavers of Georgia and South Carolina, especially once they established a permanent settlement known as Fort Mose, which was probably the first settlement created by freed slaves. This is a population that's sometimes known as Maroons in English, coming from the Spanish word cimarron, which is going to come back. Interestingly, also, there were some Afro-Cuban soldiers involved, too, who were Spanish agents who were trusted by the freedmen. I think this is kind of a funny little link here because it sort of reminds me of the role of Afro-Cuban soldiers many centuries later in anti-colonial struggles in Africa. I think it's just kind of a funny little link there, a little foreshadowing. And anyways, though, the settlement at Fort Mose isn't that famous today, but it was very important to the spiritual worlds of African Americans in the 18th century. It was seen almost as this kind of land of Prester John for enslaved people. There was a city far to the south where you could be free. And this led to a lot of slaves from all across the 13 colonies escaping to get to the Spanish settlement of Florida. This leads directly to the 1739 Stono Revolt, one of the biggest slave revolts in U.S. history in South Carolina, when a group of freedmen attempted to leave South Carolina, run through Georgia, and get to North Florida. During the same time, you start to see a very interesting and closely related society beginning to coalesce in the Spanish colony. Native American refugees who spoke Muskogean languages began mixing with groups of escaped slaves and smaller numbers of Spaniards under the leadership of a man named Ahaya, also called the Cowkeeper. Ahaya brought his people and his large herd of cattle to an uninhabited part of Florida. The Spanish called these people cimarrones, which again was a word for escaped slaves, originally meaning untamed horses. But the cimarrones, this group, started adopting the name themselves, but pronounced with a Muskogean accent as Seminole. We should probably do a whole episode on the Seminoles in the future because they have an amazingly interesting history and such a crazy part of the story of Florida. But what's really important to know here is that the Seminole were an interesting third party in this conflict between the English and the Spanish, playing them off each other and taking sides with different parties in different times. Eventually, once the American Revolution would happen, the Seminoles would play a similar role between the English and the American revolutionaries. But in this time, in the early 18th century, the Seminoles are mostly involved in working covertly with the English to wipe out isolated Spanish farmsteads across North Florida. By the 1750s, when the 7 Years' War broke out, the Seminoles had hoped to get involved and claim more territory for themselves. But the British were a little bit wary about this. According to British sources, Ahaya even claimed that he couldn't enter the afterlife until he'd personally killed 100 Spaniards. However, they feared that if he was allowed to do this, then they would basically lose control of the Florida territory. So they forced the Seminole to stay out of it while they themselves went to war against the French and the Spanish.
Mm-hmm. People who studied history in the U.S. will know this as the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe.
Right.
So in 1763, the British beat the French and Spanish coalition during the 7 Years' War. And as a lot of you will remember from those same U.S. history classes, this had huge consequences for American history because it led to unquestioned English dominance over most of the United States. And while England exercised no real authority outside of the borders of the colonial settlements, colonists no longer had any serious fears of Spanish or French incursions and could more easily expand into Native American territories. The Seminole clearly recognized this, and so while other tribes signed treaties recognizing British dominance over Florida and Alabama after the 7 Years' War, the Seminole would not do this. Instead, they used the power vacuum left by the war to expand throughout much of Florida, defeating and often enslaving other tribes along the way, those who had sided with the Spanish. And as soon as the British government took control of Florida, the Spanish governor ordered the entire population of Spanish settlers to evacuate to Cuba, as well as the entire population of the Timucua peoples. They feared massacres by British troops as well as the Seminoles, who had been eyeing St. Augustine for centuries. This is kind of a reverse flow into Cuba from Florida. That's interesting.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah. And there's going to be a little bit more of that later in the episode of migration from Florida to Cuba, the kind of reverse of what you see now. But as soon as the war ends, there's a pretty cool race by both the British and the Seminoles to see who can get to the mostly empty St. Augustine first. Kind of reminds me of the end of World War II, right? With the Soviets and the Americans both trying to take as much territory as they could. Uh-huh. The British mostly had the upper hand here. They were the ones who took the city of St. Augustine, and a Scottish guy named James Grant was placed in charge of this pretty inhospitable colony, including the town of St. Augustine. He was a slaver who attempted to expand plantation slavery into Florida. However, not that many white planters wanted to go. They were due to the, close proximity to Fort Mose, as well as the fears of the Seminoles. Florida was not considered an attractive place to begin a massive slave enterprise, especially when there was so much more safer land in places like Georgia, South Carolina, and now areas like Alabama and Mississippi just beginning to be settled. But despite this, Grant was determined to work the Florida in the name of the British Crown. Two other Scotsmen named Archibald Menzies and Andrew Turnbull would propose a solution. The first of these Scottish guys, Archibald Menzies, is a much more obscure historical figure, but still a really important part of the story. He's the spark that leads to the blazing wildfire of New Smyrna, because Menzies was an amateur horticulturalist who traveled to the Ottoman Empire to learn about Middle Eastern techniques of producing cotton and olive oil. He probably had some involvement with a group of merchants known as the Levant Company, who dominated most English commerce in the Ottoman Empire. Like a lot of Western Europeans at this time, Menzies saw Middle Eastern Christians, particularly the Greeks, as helpless victims of Ottoman oppression, who needed Western governments to intervene on their behalf. I think this is a kind of very interesting story. There's a lot we can talk about maybe in a future episode, but it does kind of seem like the original, Western humanitarian interventionism.
Oh, yeah, no, this is absolutely the root of it, but that would come around a century later.
Right. Because Menzies, he had a very particular solution to the problem of Greek oppression, and a solution that was very unusual, which would have incredibly important implications on Florida history.
Yeah, so he wrote, quote, Greeks of the Levant, accustomed to a hot climate, are in general sober and industrious, and being reduced by their severe masters to the greatest misery, would be easily persuaded to fly from slavery to the protection of free government. The Greeks of the islands would be more than useful and the easiest to bring away, as they are more oppressed than any others. It may be observed that they are excellent rowers and might be of great service in the inland navigation of America.
And he said that if the Greeks weren't interested, that Armenians could be a nice substitute. And made sure to mention that
Armenian women are remarkably handsome. The circumstance would naturally prompt intermarriage between our peoples and them, and soon put an end of all distinctions. Most of our merchants in Turkey are married to Christian women of that country. Wow, least horny Englishmen.
Yeah. And I gotta think that one of the merchants he might have been thinking of was a guy named Andrew Turnbull, who is the protagonist and also the villain of this episode. Because Turnbull was this Scottish multi-hyphenate, a doctor, trader, and part-time diplomat operating in Ottoman Turkey. He was married to a woman of obscure origins from the town of Smyrna, whom contemporary sources noted as particularly elegant and engaging. We don't know much about her, but she is really important to this story, because she was a Christian named Gracia Dura Bin, which might be a corruption of the French name Du Robin. All we really know is that she was a Greek speaker, she was a Christian, and she was very interested in Florida. We don't know if Andrew Turnbull and Gracia ever met Archibald Menzies, but they put his plan into action. With both of their connections to the Greek community of the Ottoman Empire, they began gathering funds to recruit 500 Greek workers to settle in Florida. Gracia had deep connections with the Christians of Smyrna, which is why they planned to form a new city, which they would call New Smyrna, surviving today as New Smyrna Beach. With his wife's family connections, Andrew Turnbull began speaking to the local Christian clergy in Smyrna, with plans to recruit fishermen, farmers, and sailors. He sailed to Florida alone in 1767 to meet with Grant, the Scottish governor, and was rewarded with 20,000 acres of free real estate and 20,000 more promised to other Scottish merchants he could recruit. He made plans for this great colony, which would be the biggest settlement in Florida since the failed French Huguenot expedition 2 centuries prior, which could be a bastion of British power that could be eventually projected to Cuba, Louisiana, and even Mexico. And most importantly, the laborers here would be free men. They'd be Europeans. There wouldn't be this fear of them escaping to join Fort Mose or the Seminoles. And also, they weren't even Catholic. These guys were Orthodox Christians who wouldn't sympathize with the Spanish. They'd call his Christian utopia New Smyrna. As they said, that's where he wanted the workers to be from. A little irony here is that although this colony was intended to be an alternative to slave labor, most of the land would be cleared by African slaves themselves, which I think, says kind of a lot about his integrity here.
So Governor Grant, he signed the paperwork and he eagerly sent news to London about the project. The Board of Trade put their full faith in Turnbull and even gave him access to Royal Navy sloops to transport these immigrants. And in fact, he would even get funding from them, enough money to pay 40 shillings to every adult Greek settler. That comes out to around $600 today. So it's not that much, but for these people who were literal dirt farmers from 18th century Greece, it would have been very enticing. And so Andrew Turnbull and Gracia sailed to Smyrna to begin their recruitment. But initially they found that nobody wanted to join them. It turned out that a group of rival British merchants from the Levant Company worried that they would be stealing away Greek sailors and stevedores that they relied on. In fact, they even went so far as to bribe Ottoman police to prevent any Christians from emigrating.
Right, which is really not an auspicious start to New Smyrna, because it meant that, as far as I know, I think there would only be like 2 actual Smyrniotes. Instead, he had to go farther afield to places where Ottoman control was less tight and where the Levant Company wasn't as active. One of the places he landed on was the infamously inaccessible Mani Peninsula, which is famous for being so remote that its citizens were allegedly not even Christianized until the year 1000, like 700 years after everywhere else, pretty much. Isn't that wild?
Wow. Yeah, no, that's crazy.
Yeah. So, and these people in the Mani Peninsula, they'd never heard of America. I don't think any of them had heard of the New World. And I wouldn't be surprised if many of them had never even heard of England or Scotland. And I think that this isolation, this is an extreme example, but it is kind of connected to the broader situation of Greece. Because people like Andrew Turnbull had an image of Greece and Greek culture based on their classical education. It wasn't necessarily about any affection for real Greek culture, but really who they imagined the Greeks used to be. They supported Greek struggles for independence not because they cared about the things Greeks cared about, like Ottoman tax policies, like the independence of the Orthodox Church, or the legacy of the Byzantines, but because they saw the Greeks as descendants of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who they also saw as their own cultural ancestors, in a sense. This is why across the 18th and 19th and even the 20th century, there's a long tradition of Western support for anybody with a Greek last name, because they saw the Greeks as basically more virtuous, more enlightened, more intelligent than other peoples in the region, particularly Muslims. And if Greece was isolated in the 18th century, the Mani Peninsula was the most isolated part at all. This is just this rocky dagger jutting into the Aegean near the location of ancient Sparta. I think that actually, if there's any real close link to ancient Greek culture, it's that the Maniotes at this point were still very warlike, just like the ancient Spartans. Blood feuds between Maniote clans led to a lot of adult men dying. In addition, just a couple years before Turnbull and his wife Gracia arrived here, an Ottoman brigade had executed a lot of local men for suspected involvement in a failed revolt. So when Turnbull and Gracia climb up the rocky cliffs to greet the people of the Mani Peninsula, a lot of them are really willing to leave their homes for any kind of a new life abroad. Turnbull was amazed at how little convincing these men took. He noted in his diary,
"It was cruel tyranny and most pinching poverty that made them wish to fly from such complicated distress. Otherwise, they would not have emigrated. For there is not a nation on earth more prejudiced in favor of their own country than the Greeks, and indeed with reason."
On the way out of the Mani Peninsula, they found that their ship was being tailed by a group of threatening fishermen who he believed were Turks paid by the Levant Company to stop him from recruiting Greeks. This meant that he couldn't really recruit in Greece much longer. Instead, he had to go farther west. So after this hairy encounter, he sailed west and landed in Italy. And surprisingly, a lot of local Corsicans that he met were actually descended of earlier Maniote refugees who had fled a previous clash with the Ottomans 100 years prior and settled on the island. So first, he has a few hundred guys from the Mani Peninsula. He has a few hundred more guys from Corsica who are mostly Greek speakers. But interestingly, despite this, the bulk of the settlers of New Smyrna wouldn't end up being Greeks at all. Because right when he was about to leave Corsica and head to build this great Greek colony in America, one of his men alerted him that they had some stowaways. They had 100 stowaways. These were 100 Catalans from the Spanish island of Minorca, which was now a British possession. They had heard about the scheme to go to America, and they jumped on the ship, pleading that he take them with him. Turnbull was of two minds about this. On one hand, he wanted all the settlers he could get. On the other hand, these guys weren't Greeks. They were Spanish Catholics. They weren't the kind of people he idolized, or at least he imagined he would idolize. These guys weren't the descendants of Socrates. They're just fishermen. And again, the fact that they have this Spanish affinity might be a problem. The Spanish were their sworn enemies. But then he came to a really dark realization, with a realization that echoes stay in an unfortunate way. Because he realized that these Minorcans were so desperate to emigrate to America that they would endure any condition once they got there. He didn't offer them the 40 shillings he paid to the Greeks, and he didn't really offer them any real contract at all. Instead, Turnbull decided he could use these desperate Minorcans as indefinite tenant farmers, turning them into peasants for the rest of their lives. Which, it's the same kind of exploitation you see today with immigration. a very relevant Florida story.
Yeah, and so when all was said and done, they had a fleet of around 400 Greeks, 800 Minorcans, and they sailed to Florida. This was met with huge fanfare by European writers all across the continent, really. The French anti-slavery writer Abbé Raynal saw the foundation of New Smyrna as not only a victory against slave power and Ottoman oppression, but something that could even lead to a new golden age of classical learning among the Greeks. A common belief among Westerners was that the Greeks were inherently brilliant, but that their spirit had been crushed by centuries of foreign rule. If they could not be freemen in Greece, then at the very least they could be freemen in Florida. Abbé Raynal wrote, "Why should not Athens and Lacedaemon be one day revived in North America? Why should not the city of Turnbull become in a few centuries the residence of politeness, of fine arts, and of eloquence? The new colony is less distant from the flourishing state than were the barbarous Pelasgians from the fellow citizens of Pericles." But before we get to the colony itself, one last funny note about Turnbull. In the hopes of greasing palms with London officials who were funding this operation, he made sure to loot some marble statues from his voyages and columns from all over the towns that he visited, and he sent them over to London, where many of them remain on display today.
Classic story. Right. So after a few weeks of journeying, 1,400 Mediterranean immigrants arrived in Florida, immediately becoming the bulk of the entire population in the colony. The presence of the Corsicans arguably makes this the beginning of the Italian-American presence in the US, and of course also the Greek-American presence. It's also one of the biggest, you could argue, Latin American presences, because, these guys, at least maybe not, they weren't Latin American per se, but they were, they were Spanish speakers. They would be considered Hispanic today. And a lot of their descendants are typically considered among the early prominent Latinos in the US. Anyways, these immigrants get to St. Augustine and are immediately taken in by the beauty of the scenery. But then Turnbull tells them, we're not staying in St. Augustine. We're going south toward a swampier part of the coast. On one of the first days there, a Minorcan learned from a local Cuban person that the Spanish had a name for this area because the stretch of coast south of St. Augustine was known as Los Mosquitos, and not without reason.
Panagopoulos wrote, quote, "Life in New Smyrna certainly was not what the newcomers had expected. Nature was beautiful there, the land extensive, and some of it would become theirs in time. But at their arrival, it was only wilderness, and they had to wait a long time until cultivated it could eventually support them. In the meantime, they had to work hard, and their overseers, former non-commissioned officers of the British Army and some Italians, made work even harder. Their families were suffering, food was scarce, and there was danger of death by starvation. The lagoons had plenty of fish, and there were many good fishermen, but fishing required time, and time no one was permitted to have because it was so badly needed for the establishment of a plantation."
Right. So basically, as soon as people were dropped off there, they suddenly had to build their own shelter, find their own food, totally fend for themselves, and they had no way to leave. So it's basically like an 18th century fire festival. Rather than letting his workers attend their own needs, including mourning the more than 200 relatives who died in the journey, Turnbull immediately put these people to work growing indigo. Indigo was one of the most laborious crops to plant and harvest, especially in the Florida heat and humidity. Also, it's incredibly toxic. There's really no way to grow indigo in a way that's going to be healthy. A lot of people are going to die. Despite this, after a few months, they managed to plant their first crop. And Turnbull invites a big group of South Carolina slave owners to visit this new model colony of New Smyrna. South Carolina at this time was notorious even among the South for the brutality of the slavery that existed there. Black people were enslaved in ways that were generally more brutal than in North Carolina or Virginia, where extreme violence was more accepted. And there was generally a much larger proportion of slaves to free people. But when these guys from South Carolina saw the success of New Smyrna at the time, they were really impressed. And so, which means that these guys, who were like the most brutal slave owners on the planet, thought that this system of free indentured workers was better. So on one hand, it's kind of interesting, right? It's like a moment where the oppressor recognizes that perhaps they're wrong. But on the other hand, you got to wonder, is it really a good thing if the most brutal slave owners on the planet approve of your system? Like, is that an endorsement that you want?
They probably would have slept a lot easier knowing that, they don't literally own a bunch of guys who want them dead by any means necessary. So
he started making these trade deals with the South Carolinians, which made him a huge profit even before the first harvest was made. But his tyrannical labor practices meant that basically none of this wealth went into the pockets of the workers themselves. The Menorcans especially, who didn't have contracts, were working these fields forever without pay. The Greeks had to work their land for 7 years. And I think that 7 years in these conditions, in this heat, would have probably felt like 70. Turnbull, this is just 3 months in, Turnbull goes back to St. Augustine with the slave owners to see them off. He wrote that one of the slave owners predicted that if everything goes well, New Smyrna will be the best settlement upon the continent of America. And now I gotta ask you, Sam, would it surprise you if I told you everything would not go well in New Smyrna?
Well, considering the setup so far, I'd have to say that chances are looking slim.
Right. And they would go south basically immediately, because the very next morning after Turnbull got back to New Smyrna, the colony was in pandemonium. It was in revolt. Just 3 months after its foundation, the largest colony in Florida became the site of the first and probably the largest ever workers' revolt in Florida. And they were doing this out of self-preservation, because within just a few days of arriving in Florida, the workers started getting sick. Strong men who'd spent their entire lives on farms would get struck in with an unexpected fatigue. That night, they'd be sweating with fever and shivering from chills. The next day, they'd be vomiting any food that they tried to keep down. And the third day, they'd be dead. Because the Spanish name for this place, Los Mosquitos, was a warning. Mosquitoes transmitted malaria to almost anybody who stepped into the swamp. And now malaria was devastating the workforce and tragically dashing hundreds of dreams of a happy life in America. This meant that, despite differences in their language and their religion, the workers decided to band together to overthrow the men who'd put them into this terrible bondage and force them to work in this really awful situation. The workers broke into Turnbull's personal food stores to feed their family. The most hated of the overseers was even tied up and tortured. His ears were lopped off as revenge for the beatings he'd incurred in just 3 months. The guy's name was, fiddling enough, Cutter.
Oh, that's a Dickensian-esque name. The workers, while they were going around, they found a room full of guns, which they distributed amongst themselves. And that's when they realized that they weren't just in control of the colony. They had, in fact, the potential to take over all of British Florida. And so the riders marched on St. Augustine to find Turnbull and Governor Grant. During all this, a Corsican man named Carlo Forni, who had left Europe just to escape a rape conviction, took advantage of the chaos to pillage surrounding farms and slaughter cattle. Governor Grant quickly realized that essentially a rebel army was marching towards St. Augustine, set out with a ship full of soldiers to search the coast for them. The British found them attempting to float one of the ships that had brought them to Florida, probably in the hopes of sailing back.
Yeah, all the way to Minorca.
So the British shot a single cannonball into the crowd, which scared away most of the rebels. A few dozen more ended up getting into a rowboat of that ship and sailed out, hoping to reach Cuba. Grant's men pursued them all the way down the coast, and eventually they were shipwrecked in the Keys, right by modern-day Miami. When Grant's army reached New Smyrna itself, the rest of the rebels promptly put down their arms and refused to name who had taken part in the rebellion. When Turnbull received word that some of the known rebels had been captured in the Keys, he demanded that they be made an example of. But Grant warned him that these workers held the cards here. The Greeks and the Menorcans and the Corsicans who made up New Smyrna were the bulk of the European population here, and colonization could not happen without their consent. Meanwhile, the rapist Carlo Forni was put to death for his pillaging crimes, along with the man who had cut off the ears of Cutter. One man named Elias Medici was also ordered to be killed for slaughtering a cow, but bargained for his freedom when he offered to become the St. Augustine executioner instead. And yeah, that's a great Uno reverse card move if I've seen one.
Yeah. After he made that deal, he started getting second thoughts. There's actually a pretty remarkable account of one of Turnbull's overseers of the execution of the two other guys, which was that, "On this occasion, I saw one of the most moving scenes I ever experienced. Long and obstinate was the struggle of this man's mind, who repeatedly called out that he would instead choose to die rather than be the executioner of his friends in distress. This perplexed the sheriff, till at last the entreaties of the victims themselves put an end to the conflicts in the executioner's breast, when they encouraged him to act. Now we beheld a man thus compelled to mount the ladder, taking leave of his friends in the most moving manner, kissing them the moment before he committed them to an ignominious death." And strangely, after this terribly inauspicious start, things mostly went back to normal as things can be when people are dying 10 a week by malaria. By the end of the year, of the 1,400 men, women, and children who had left the Mediterranean for Florida, only about 1,000 were left. However, the disease rates slowly died down for an interesting reason. That was that malaria was not common on the Mani Peninsula at this time. And it wasn't very common in Corsica either. So those two populations had very little resistance. However, Minorca already had a lot of malaria. There was a lot of resistance in that population. So this meant that as the diseases spread through the population, most Greeks and Corsicans died, but most Catalans survived. This meant that after a couple years, New Smyrna was now a lot more like New Minorca. The fact that the Catalans were more likely to survive malaria led to a lot of distrust and confusion among the overseers. Turnbull was convinced that anybody who survived malaria was just faking being sick to avoid work. On one occasion, a supervisor beat a man to death in hopes of getting him to admit that he wasn't really sick. And just in case there's any confusion here, Turnbull was fully aware of this brutality. He endorsed it explicitly. According to a later court testimony, once he eventually was, in a sense, sort of held accountable, it was revealed that he told his overseers that they could kill any man for any reason. He just didn't want to be around because he didn't want to get his own hands dirty. So they had to do it for him, right? Which I think is pretty sleazy, right? Like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
no.
And so, yeah, just really, really bad stuff. Whenever a dispute broke out between two of the colonists, his only answer was violence. There was one case when one woman punched another and she complained to Turnbull. So Turnbull said, all right. And he handed the victim a whip and says, you have to whip her now. That's how you get your revenge. So really, yeah, really brutal situation.
Yeah, this guy was a sicko.
Yeah, absolutely a sicko. And so this is a situation that, like, on paper, this is definitely better than chattel slavery because these people do have some rights, which is why eventually, jumping ahead here, they are able to take this guy to court. But in practice, although, this wasn't a permanent situation for most of them, or at least for a lot of them, it's still incredibly brutal. And even though Turnbull wanted this to be an alternative to the cruelties of chattel slavery, it seems like he was personally as much of a bastard as any of those South Carolina plantation owners. He was a really, really bad guy. And he used his leverage over these desperate workers to do just unspeakable brutality. The kind of brutality that you see, like we said, you see in chattel slavery and you see today in the exploitation of immigrants, especially in places like Florida, where there are a lot of very underpaid immigrant laborers who endure brutality not too different from this.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that he did, which you also hear a lot about today, was constantly reneging on these contracts. So a lot of the Greeks actually had signed 4-year contracts rather than 7. But once these 4 years expired, he told them, oh, no, you're mistaken. When they tried to leave, they were locked up in irons and given longer contracts.
Yeah, this was a really common story for indentured servants across the board. Like, theoretically, yes, once you're like in America for 7 years, then you're free to go. But who exactly is enforcing the law?
Exactly, yeah. And interestingly, Turnbull also used another very effective tactic to keep people working on the plantation, which was fear of the Seminoles. And this is interesting because Florida in the 1760s had unusually good relations between settlers and natives. According to Panagopoulos, under Governor Grant, this colony was the only place in the Americas where a white man could expect to be hanged for committing a crime against a Native American. But despite these warm relations, stories were circulated by Turnbull and his overseers of the supposed brutality of the Seminoles. And I'm sure there was some reason to fear these guys because they had led a lot of attacks on Spanish settlers previously. There were cases of individual Seminoles getting into clashes with colonists, but
yeah, no, not friendly, and also harboring a lot of escaped slaves who probably have revenge on the mind.
Yeah. So these fears weren't totally unfounded, but they didn't really reflect the reality of relations at the time. But it was enough to keep away most of the workers from, trying to join the Seminoles, just as escaped slaves would often do. There was one big issue, though, that led to real tensions between the Minorcan Catalans and the Seminoles, which was the fact that the Seminoles saw these guys as Spaniards. And like we mentioned, a lot of Seminoles, like Ahaya, really hated the Spanish more than they hated the English at this time. And so to assuage these fears, Governor Grant actually visited Seminole territory to explain that these guys weren't really Spanish. And he made a statement which is interesting and also reveals a lot about the racial politics of the time.
Yeah, he said, quote, quote, "The people at the Mosquitoes are not white people, but neither are they Spaniards. They are subjects of our great king, who came from a little island oppressed by the Spaniards, whom too they hated, and now had come to help their English brothers cultivate the new lands." That's probably the first time I've seen someone from this period say, "Oh yeah, they're not white," not in a disparaging manner.
So yeah, Governor Grant, he was not a great guy. He was a strong advocate for slavery, but he was a big advocate for peaceful relations with the Seminoles. But in 1771, he got sick and returned home to Scotland, where he was replaced by an American colonist, a new governor, James Moultrie of South Carolina, who had much less interest in preserving peace with the Seminoles, and also would have a much worse relationship with Andrew Turnbull and New Smyrna. We're not exactly sure how this dispute started, but Turnbull had very little respect for Moultrie. It's possibly because Grant was also Scottish, but this guy was just from the colonies. But they didn't get along. Another issue is that after a few years, the Spanish government in Cuba decided that they weren't exactly comfortable with hundreds of Spanish speakers living in a British colony. The Bishop of Santiago was intent on finishing the work that Pedro Menendez started 200 years before, wiping out Protestantism in the Americas. He sent a team of Cuban and Irish missionaries to New Smyrna to enforce Catholic orthodoxy among the Menorcans. Turnbull found out about this and reluctantly allowed these guys to lead church services, but this was not accepted by Moultrie. It's probably not a coincidence that in his native South Carolina, Catholicism was absolutely banned. Most colonies prohibited missionary activity. Florida was kind of a Wild West situation, so they allowed this thing to happen, but it led to even more tensions between Turnbull and Governor Moultrie. They refused to communicate with each other directly, which meant that whenever Turnbull needed anything from the government, instead of requesting it from the governor, as he was supposed to, he sent letters directly to London. This was a huge offense to Moultrie's legitimacy, which would eventually have very serious ramifications on the colony. It meant that, as revenge for this insubordination, Moultrie pulled military support away from New Smyrna, basically leaving the colony open to any kind of potential incursions by the Seminoles. And then the next year, 1775, something very big happens. A long simmering cauldron begins to boil over, this being the American Revolution. And Moultrie, as an American-born colonist, was suspected of disloyalty, suddenly replaced by the Englishman Patrick Tonin, who was believed to be more loyal, but he also had a very poor relationship with Andrew Turnbull and the colony of New Smyrna.
Yeah, Tonin, he really caused a stir by hiring Seminole mercenaries to patrol St. Augustine and the New Smyrna plantation. But maybe even more controversially, he organized groups of Seminole troops to attack revolutionaries in Georgia, leading to European settlers, including those at New Smyrna, to distrust Tonin and the Seminoles, where previously there had been more or less stable relations between the colonists and the Seminoles. But ultimately, this distrust wasn't really unwarranted, because as the American Revolution progressed, some of the Seminole soldiers began intimidating and robbing the people of New Smyrna. They were authorized to take necessary food and shelter, the kinds of things that led to the Third Amendment in our Constitution. But there were also reports that these guys had also stolen luxury goods like wine and honey and dresses for their wives. I mean, you're out shopping, you got to get your wife a nice dress. Of course.
Yeah. And because Turnbull had no way to resist these incursions, they kept coming. Cattle were being slaughtered. Eventually, jewelry and money were stolen. So this is a pretty good time to be a Seminole raider, but not a great time to be a New Smyrna colonist, which led to new resentments between the colonists and the elites, including figures like Tonin, who had, authorized these Seminoles to begin patrolling the colony, as well as tensions with Turnbull and his overseers. And these were tensions that were always there, given the absolute brutality that he used to keep his workers in line. All of this meant that one night in 1775, a group of predominantly Menorcan workers met with some literate, educated Englishmen who told them that the way they were being treated was unjust and even illegal. And together, this new coalition, this, worker and lawyer coalition, planned their own miniature American Revolution.
Let's go.
This was not a real workers' revolt. They didn't attempt to violently seize the colony like they had before, which honestly, if you're asking me, big missed opportunity to put down your guns as soon as you hear a cannon shot.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, this time, though, 300 men, women, and children grabbed their pitchforks and torches and marched toward Turnbull's house. They've roused him and Gracia from their beds and tell them that they're at their mercy, but they're not going to hurt them. They're going to do something much worse. They are going to sue them in a court of law and demand what they're owed. According to contemporary reports, the Menorcans marched like the children of Israel from a place that had proved an Egypt to them, walking the short distance from New Smyrna to St. Augustine, where they would eventually settle in the town and have a 6-month-long court battle between Turnbull and his workers.
Oh boy.
Large numbers of translators were hired to convey the stories of Turnbull's cruelty. One of the men claimed that if I was to tell everything that happened in this one of the men said that if he was to tell everything that happened in this plantation, the trial would never end because there were so many stories of cruelty. And the big dark cloud hanging over all of this was the American Revolution. As 1775 turned into 1776, it became an open war. It was clear that British control over Florida was really tenuous. If the revolution took hold in the upper 13 colonies, the government of Florida could very easily be overthrown too. So Tonin took the pretty unusual step of completely siding with the workers against capital. He said that every one of them would be immediately released from their contracts, even if they had agreed to bondage. All of the workers were given land in nearby parts of Florida or offered settlement in the city of St. Augustine. Others joined the Seminole militias that were about to be deployed in Georgia. Many of them would eventually intermarry with the Seminoles and become part of the Seminole community, which is still a very important part of the Florida cultural landscape today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really a great use of the law here, just because like naturally this verdict didn't come about because the British judge had a heart full of mercy or whatever. No, at a certain point, I'm sure the calculus was, all right, these Americans are messing with us. We're going to mess with their labor supply. We're going to have their workers be free from the contracts that they signed with them. Voila, enjoy your American Revolution.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And this really would be the end of the New Smyrna dream, or from the perspective of the people actually working there, the New Smyrna nightmare, because they didn't want to stay on the farm anymore. A few families did want to stay to work the land, but not enough to really make a profit for Turnbull. To add insult to injury, out of spite or benevolence, Tonin also hired 2 men described as a Spaniard and a half-Spaniard to communicate with the remaining few Iberian families to convince them to slowly leave for St. Augustine. Interestingly, actually, thousands of people descended from those Catalans still live in St. Augustine today and have been a pretty big part of that community for centuries. But by 1777, New Smyrna was completely abandoned. Andrew Turnbull was defeated. The dream of a new Athens in America was gone, and its mad founder asked the governor if he could at least have the liberty of mourning over this deserted village. After the workers left, Andrew and Gracia Turnbull remained for years in the ruins of this great and terrible experiment. Part of him probably felt like a failure, but I also kind of wonder if another part of him was kind of happy, Because, think about it. Gets to live in the ruins of a Greek colony, doesn't have to worry about actual Greeks themselves. That's kind of what he always wanted.
Yeah, but presumably he would have wanted those people to be there and working for him, processing all that toxic indigo so he could live it up in high society.
Yeah, I just think there's kind of a broader story here where Europeans love the idea of Greeks. They don't love who Greeks actually are. In this case, Greeks being valiant laborers fighting for their own freedom, not wanting to toil under this very near slavery by some random British guy.
Yeah, and I'm sure that this won't come as a surprise to any of you, but after the New Smyrna colony collapsed, the British lost the American Revolution. As part of the treaty negotiations, Florida was handed back to Spain, and the Catalans were initially treated with suspicion, but after they all pledged their loyalty to the Spanish crown, they became the most prominent citizens in Florida. The remaining Greeks assimilated into Spanish colonial society, and eventually, in 1821, the new United States would gain control of Florida. A large migration of Anglo settlers, as well as enslaved Africans, soon overwhelmed the Menorcan community.
Yeah, although as one kind of interesting legacy of Spanish rule, St. Augustine in the early 19th century was one of the only parts of the United States, apart from New Orleans, where interracial marriage was legal. So the Florida Museum at St. Augustine mentions that a few mixed families of Catalans, Seminoles, and African Americans lived across Northeast Florida. But once the Anglos started coming in, they suddenly found themselves basically in danger. They would be intimidated by Dixie newcomers into surrendering their lands and breaking apart their mixed families. So a lot of them would migrate to other parts of the Spanish Empire, like Mexico and particularly Cuba. In 1835, a Seminole army burned down what remained of New Smyrna, and I gotta wonder if any of those warriors themselves might have been descendants of some of the Minorcans who had, come there decades earlier.
Oh yeah, that's great. Just like some Seminole guy is excited to finally see the place where his grandfather had toiled for years, and he finally gets to put it to flame. That sounds like
Absolutely, yeah. And not long after this, one Minorcan in St. Augustine named Joseph Marion Hernandez is generally considered to become the first U.S. congressman. Another guy would have a very different life. His name was Agustin Zamorano, and so he would travel to Mexico, first fighting with the Spanish against the Mexican War of Independence, and then after losing that war, joining the Mexican army. But then as relations soured between the California settlers and the Mexicans, he eventually led his own little revolt against the Mexican government for a pretty shitty reason. The Mexican government was trying to intervene in behalf of Mission Indians to uphold land grants made by the Spanish, and he wanted to nullify those grants to steal the land for themselves. There was one other important descendant I think we should mention. This is a guy named Stephen Vincent Benet. If you've heard of him, it's because he was a 20th century writer who wrote the story The Devil and Daniel Webster. But he also wrote this somewhat touching poem about his Minorcan ancestors who arrived with Turnbull. If you could share this, Sam.
They came here, they toiled here, they broke their hearts afar. It was not so to be. Let us remember them, men from overseas. They lived here and died here. They left singing names.
Right, and I think that sums up the experience of the new Florida colonists, as well as the broader picture of European settlement in Florida. For so many centuries, people from Europe have tried to seize control over this land, usually through violent means, and make it their own. But disease and indigenous resistance and the revenge of Mother Nature always take their toll. It seems like these days Florida's kind of having a moment, right? It's the cryptocurrency capital, it's a huge real estate market, and more people are moving to cities like Miami, Orlando, and also New Smyrna every year. Malaria isn't a problem anymore, and the Seminole Nation have not yet broken the temporary ceasefire they began in 1858.
Yet.
But nature's still a problem. Florida today might not look much like the Florida of Andrew Turnbull's time, but I'm curious what Florida might look like in 200 more years,
Probably a lot wetter.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, a lot wetter. Oceans are going to rise. It's possible that the swamps might fill again, and the Florida of 2500 might look a lot like the Florida of 1500, We don't know.
Well, in that case, they better start bringing over Dutch settlers. They need those dikes.
Right, that could be the next experiment. Yeah, they can, Because here's the thing, I think that it really does seem like humans just aren't supposed to build cities in Florida. Even, before colonization, indigenous settlement in Florida was pretty limited. Most of Florida only had settlement near the coast, and it wasn't generally as urbanized as you saw in other places. There wasn't even agriculture in Southwest Florida. The Calusa, they were hunter-gatherers. They weren't, they were actually, interestingly, one of the only sedentary hunter-gatherer kingdoms to ever exist. They didn't have much use for agriculture, and they didn't build cities. I think that, people like Ponce de Leon, people like Andrew Turnbull, and then eventually, the Coretians, they should have taken the hint. And I gotta wonder if eventually the, current period of modern American settlement in Florida might eventually be another page in the book of failed colonial ventures in Florida.
Well, I guess time will tell.
That's right, yeah. Okay, well, this is basically kind of all we have to say about New Smyrna. I just think it's a really fun story. And as somebody from Florida, I really love exploring the ways that Florida is just such a bizarre, such a lovely, and such an evil place all at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
You got any closing thoughts, Sam, before we wrap this one up?
Don't enslave people, I guess. That's always good advice.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. Yeah. It's so funny that, you start this experiment where the whole point is like, oh, it's an alternative to slavery. And then you end up doing something almost as bad. It's like, man, what's wrong with Anglos? Or hell, let's forget what's wrong with the Spanish, killing all the French people, and then, all the constant massacres of the indigenous. It's just, it's a bloody land. It really is. Florida in particular.
Well, they hadn't invented football yet, so there was nothing else to get that energy out.
That's it. And I think that's it right there. Yeah. And on that note, thank you, Sam, for being part of this little episode today. And I hope that everyone listening liked this. I love sharing little stories like this, and I'd love to share more in the future. If anyone listening has any fun story you'd like to share about your state or your country, and you want to come on, shoot me a DM, and we'd love to share it. Thanks so much.
Yeah, we love Flow Weirda, but we love all the weird US states, all 50 of them.
That's right.